Snow fell like ash, burying the world in silence. Inside a cabin that smelled of pine resin and forgotten laughter, Daniel Reed carved a shapeless block of wood, his hands moving as if time itself had frozen. 2 winters had passed since Jasmine's death, leaving the house hollow, the garden choked with weeds, and his heart a museum of ghosts. Every creak of the floorboards echoed her absence. The armchair by the hearth still bore the faint imprint of her silhouette, though he hadn't dared sit there since she'd gone. He hadn't laughed in years. His days blurred into a rhythm of survival. Chopping wood, feeding the stove, staring at the frost-rimmed windows as the seasons cycled through the glass. Truth was, he'd stopped feeling the cold long ago. The chill that lived in his bones now came from somewhere deeper, a place where memories of her voice, soft and steady, had once warmed him. Outside, the storm thickened its grip on the land. Snow fell not in flurries, but in slow, deliberate sheets, covering the world inch by inch. Daniel glanced at the fire, stirred it once with the iron poker, and leaned back in his chair with a long, empty breath. His bones ached with the kind of cold that didn't come from weather. That particular chill lived deeper in the chest, where laughter had once lived. He reached for his cup, black coffee, cooled long ago, and took a swallow out of habit more than thirst. Then he heard it. 3 knocks slow, not wind tapping branches, not a raccoon scratching at the sidewall. Human. He stilled. A 4th knock followed, hesitant. A pause, then another. Daniel stood, joints protesting as he moved. He hadn't had a visitor in days, not with the road buried under snow drifts taller than a man's chest. He stepped to the door, unlatched the iron bolt, and opened it with the caution of a man who'd learned not to expect anything good from the world anymore. And yet there she stood, a woman wrapped in a frayed coat 3 sizes too big, its hem crusted with ice. Her hat was gone, hair tangled and damp from snow. Behind her, huddled beneath a single threadbare quilt, were 2 children, a boy with wide, watchful eyes and a girl clutching a ragged doll to her chest like a lifeline. Their cheeks were hollow, their lips tinged blue, but the girl's golden curls peeked out from under the quilt, defiantly bright against the gray. Margaret's eyes met his wide, uncertain, but still bright with something that hadn't yet surrendered. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Daniel felt the plea in her breath, in the way her knees seemed close to buckling, but hadn't yet. He stepped aside without a word. She guided the children in with stiff arms and murmured reassurances too quiet to hear. Daniel closed the door behind them, bolting it against the storm once more. They stood near the hearth, silent, dripping, the smallest child, golden-haired and wide-eyed, holding her soggy doll to her chest. Daniel added a log to the fire. Sparks leapt and light ballooned across the room, painting warmth onto their pale faces. Still, they said nothing. Finally, Margaret's voice came, low and hoarse. "We walked 3 days. The wagon wheel broke east of Bitter Ridge. I couldn't carry them all at once." Daniel nodded, more to acknowledge than to answer. She continued, voice steadier now. "I'm Margaret. These are mine, Elijah and Rose." The boy nodded shyly. Rose just blinked, doll clutched tighter. "You lost?" he asked, voice gravelly from disuse. "No," she said. "Left." That one word held multitudes. Daniel didn't press further. He motioned to the chairs near the hearth. "Sit. Dry off. I'll fetch something warm." They did as told. He returned minutes later with broth, simple and thin, but hot. The children didn't wait. They devoured the bowls with quiet urgency, Margaret watching them instead of eating her own. "You should eat," Daniel said. "I will," she replied. But her eyes stayed on her children. He studied her then, not with judgment, but with a cautious attention of someone who'd once known what it was to be needed and hadn't been since. Her face was sharp with hunger and pride. He could tell it cost her something to accept his help, but more to ask it. Once the children finished, they curled against one another on the braided rug, Rose between Elijah and the wall. Daniel fetched an extra quilt from the cedar chest and laid it gently over them. Margaret watched him closely. "You alone here?" she asked, not unkindly. He gave a small nod. "Been that way 2 winters now." Her eyes softened. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "Storms come. Sometimes they don't leave for a long moment." Neither spoke. The fire crackled and popped, filling the space between them. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "I try to go west of Montana City. Have family waiting, or so I thought. My husband, he turned back when we ran low on food. Said I made my bed coming out here." Daniel looked at her then fully. "He left you in winter with children." She gave a small nod. There was no storm then, just silence. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he poured her a fresh cup of coffee and slid it across the table. She took it with both hands, letting the heat soak into her skin. Her fingers trembled slightly. He didn't ask if from cold or something deeper. "You can stay," he said quietly, "till the road clears." Margaret met his gaze again. There was something unreadable in her face, part hesitation, part relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "No need. Not yet." He returned to his chair and picked up the half-shaped wood in his lap. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It had grown companionable, the kind that doesn't require filling. He noticed suddenly the way the children breathed in rhythm, the way Margaret tucked her coat closer, not to shut him out, but to keep herself steady. The fire popped again. The storm raged outside, but inside, for the first time in many months, Daniel felt the air shift. Not warm yet, but warming. He watched Margaret as she sipped her coffee, her eyes tracing the flicker of flame. She wasn't resting, not fully, but the guard around her had loosened just slightly, enough to let in light, enough to let him wonder if perhaps come spring, the weeds outside might be coaxed into bloom again. But that was a thought for later. For now, the snow fell, the candle flickered, and the small cabin held 4 lives that had, by fate or storm, come to share its breath. Daniel didn't believe in miracles anymore, but he did believe in doors that opened when they shouldn't have, and sometimes that was enough. They ate in silence, the children devouring broth with trembling hands while Margaret watched, her own bowl untouched, the steam curling upward like a ghost she dared not touch. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the cabin's rough-hewn walls, painting the room in a warmth that felt almost sacred after the storm's brutality. Elijah hunched over his bowl, his knuckles white around the spoon, every swallow deliberate, as though each mouthful was a rebellion against hunger. Rose, smaller and quieter, dipped her bread into the broth, her eyes darting to the window every few bites, as if expecting the wind to howl back to life and tear the fragile piece apart. Margaret's gaze lingered on them, her throat tight, her own hunger eclipsed by the rawness of simply being here, alive and warm and not alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, frayed at the edges like the hem of her coat. "We walked 3 days. The wagon wheel broke east of Bitter Ridge." Her words hung in the air, not an explanation, but a confession. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight, not asking why they'd left. Not yet. He didn't press when she said, "We didn't get lost. We left." Though the weight of those words pressed against his ribs like the cold he'd carried since Jasmine's death. He handed her coffee, the mug warmed by his calloused hands, noticing the way her fingers trembled, not just from cold, but from something deeper, something that had clawed its way through 3 days of snow and silence. She wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her skin, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second, as if memorizing the sensation. Daniel sat across from her, his own coffee cooling untouched. He didn't speak. The fire popped, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. That night, the children curled on the rug like tangled vines, their breaths sinking into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Elijah clutched the wooden horse Daniel had given him, his grip slackening only when Rose's head found his shoulder. Margaret watched them sleep, her back rigid against the chair, her eyes tracking every flicker of their lashes, every shallow rise of their chests. When Daniel draped a second quilt over them, his movements slow and deliberate, she didn't thank him. She couldn't. Gratitude felt like a debt she couldn't repay. He lingered, his shadow stretching long across the floor, his eyes settling on her with a quiet intensity that made her chest ache. She met his gaze, a question unspoken blooming between them like a fragile flower in frost. "Why are you helping us?" He didn't answer. He didn't know yet. Instead, he crouched beside the hearth, stoking the fire until the flames leapt higher, their glow softening the sharp angles of his face. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with all the things they weren't ready to say. The grief he wore like a second skin, the fear she hid behind steady hands, the way the children's presence had already begun to shift the air in the room, as if the cabin itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for 2 long winters. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside, something else was beginning to stir. By morning, the storm had retreated, leaving the plains blanched and fragile, as though the world itself had been hollowed by winter's grip. Margaret stirred before the children, her movements cautious, trained by survival. She moved like someone who had learned to measure every breath, every step, as if the floorboards might creak a warning to unseen threats. The cabin smelled of ash and pine resin, the lingering scent of last night's fire mingling with the faint sweetness of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. She found Daniel in the kitchen, his broad frame silhouetted against the pale light filtering through the frosted window. He stood over a pot of oats, stirring with slow, deliberate motions, the wooden spoon scraping the iron pan like a metronome counting time. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved not with impatience, but with the weight of habit, like a man used to feeding ghosts, not people. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet as she accepted the bowl he handed her. The oats were thick and warm, flecked with salt, a simplicity that felt almost sacred after days of hunger. She wrapped her hands around the chipped ceramic, letting the heat seep into her fingers, her eyes tracing the lines of wear on his face. He shrugged, handing her a spoon without meeting her gaze. "No need," he muttered, though his voice lacked the sharpness of dismissal. It was a phrase he'd likely repeated often, a shield against gratitude he didn't know how to accept. Outside, the horizon bled into pale blue, the sky so thin it might shatter under the weight of its own fragility. Snow hung heavy on the branches of the pines beyond the window, their boughs sagging under the burden. Daniel leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the landscape, as though searching for something lost in the white expanse. "The trails are gone," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. Margaret didn't look up. She knew the trails were gone, not just buried by snow, but erased by choice. The past had no claim here, not anymore. "I'm not trying to find them," she replied, her words steady but quiet, as though speaking too loudly might wake the ghosts they'd both left behind. The children woke slowly, their cheeks flushing with warmth as the fire's glow reached them. Rose stirred first, her small fingers tightening around the ragged doll she'd named Abigail, its stitched eyes gazing up at her with silent understanding. Elijah followed, his tousled hair falling into his face as he sat up, blinking against the morning light. They moved with the careful grace of creatures who had learned to survive, but not yet to trust comfort. When Elijah spotted the wooden horse on the mantel, a toy Daniel had carved long ago, never played with, kept for reasons he couldn't name, his eyes lit with something raw and unguarded. He climbed to his feet, padding across the floor in mismatched socks until he stood before the shelf, his breath catching as he reached for it. "You made this?" he asked, turning to Daniel, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. The horse was worn smooth by time, its mane etched with delicate precision, its legs sturdy despite their small size. Daniel nodded, his throat tightening around the memory of why he'd carved it in the first place. A gift for a child who'd never lived to see it, a relic of a life that had crumbled like dry leaves. "You can keep it," he said, the words coming out gruff but genuine. Elijah grinned, a sudden, sunlit thing that made Daniel's chest ache with a memory of joy he'd thought lost forever. Rose watched from the rug, her doll clutched to her chest, her gaze flickering between Daniel and her brother. Slowly, she stood, padding to Elijah's side to peer at the horse, her lips parting in a shy smile. The sound of their laughter, tentative but real, filled the cabin, weaving through the cracks in its walls like light through stained glass. Margaret observed them, her heart aching with the unfamiliar sensation of safety. She saw how Daniel watched the children, his calloused hands resting on the counter as though anchoring himself to the present. For the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between them wasn't heavy with unspoken questions but light, almost expectant, as though the air itself had begun to thaw. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside, something new had begun to stir, a fragile, tentative warmth that neither dared name, but both felt in the marrow of their bones. Days blurred into routine, the rhythm of shared life knitting itself into the fabric of the cabin like ivy reclaiming an old stone wall. Daniel's mornings began with the sharp thwack of axe meeting log, the sound echoing across the thawing landscape as snow melted in slow rivulets down the pine needles. Chips of wood scattered like confetti at his feet, each swing a meditation on purpose, on presence. Margaret, meanwhile, moved through the cabin with quiet precision, her fingers deftly mending shirts by the firelight, the needle flashing like a silver comet as she stitched tears left by thorn branches and hurried escapes. Her hands, once trembling with exhaustion, now worked with a steadiness that spoke of quiet resilience. A seamstress weaving not just fabric, but stability. Outside, Elijah and Rose chased rabbits through the slushy underbrush, their laughter sharp and bright against the muted tones of early spring. Elijah, bold as a sparrow, darted ahead, his patched boots kicking up sprays of mud as Rose trailed behind, clutching her doll, Jasmine, to her chest like a talisman. The doll's stitched eyes seemed to watch everything, its frayed edges a mirror of Rose's own weariness. Yet her grip never loosened, not even when Elijah turned to grin at her, declaring victory in their game of tag. Daniel carved again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, a fox's sleek curves emerging under his knife, its tail curling like smoke. Elijah sat beside him on a splintered stool, mimicking his strokes with a dull blade, his brow furrowed in concentration. "A bear," he declared proudly, holding up a jagged lump of pine. Daniel's chuckle rumbled low, rough as the bark he peeled away. "Close enough," he said, guiding the boy's hand to shape the wood into something smoother. Nearby, Theo knelt by the hearth, scraps of paper littered around him like fallen leaves. His charcoal sketches of the wooden horse, its mane flying, legs mid-gallop, were tacked to the cabin walls, each line sharper than the last, as if he were etching defiance into the air. Margaret cooked stews that simmered with rosemary and thyme, the herbs crushed between her fingers to release their earthy perfume. The cabin smelled of broth and memory, of something ancient and nurturing. One evening, as she kneaded dough, Daniel watched her, a silent observer of small miracles. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, flour dusting her knuckles like early snow. "You eat too little," she murmured, sliding a bowl of steaming stew toward him without looking up. He hesitated, the words unfamiliar in their tenderness, then lifted the spoon. The broth was rich, savory, and suddenly he tasted not just food, but care, a flavor he'd forgotten existed. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, realizing how long it had been since a meal felt less like survival and more like communion. Around them, the cabin hummed with life, its walls no longer echoing with ghosts, but with the soft, relentless pulse of belonging. The thaw came quietly, as if the land itself feared disturbing the fragile peace settling over the cabin. Icicles clung to the eaves like crystalline tears, weeping into puddles that glistened under the pale spring sun. Birds returned in hesitant clusters, their songs tentative yet bright, stitching melody into the silence left by winter's retreat. The creek, long imprisoned beneath a skin of cracked ice, began to murmur again, its waters whispering secrets to the stones as they flowed southward. Even the air felt different, softer, laced with the earthy scent of thawing soil and the faint sweetness of pine sap. Yet the most profound shift was not in the landscape, but in the quiet rhythm of life within the cabin. Daniel and Margaret moved through their days like two threads weaving themselves into the same tapestry. Their actions no longer marked by the cautious distance of strangers, but by the unspoken understanding of those who had begun to share something deeper than words. It was on one such evening, as dusk bled into indigo and the fire crackled low, that the fragile harmony was tested. Theo woke suddenly, his small body trembling with fever, his breath shallow and uneven. Margaret was at his side in an instant, her hands brushing his damp forehead, her voice a soothing hum as she gathered him into her arms. His whimper pierced the quiet, sharp with discomfort, and she rocked him gently, her eyes darting to Daniel where he sat near the hearth. Without a word, he rose, his movements deliberate and calm, disappearing into the shadows of the kitchen. Moments later, he returned with a steaming mug of willow bark tea, its bitter aroma mingling with the smoky scent of the fire. He knelt beside Margaret, handing her the cup with a steadiness that belied the worry in his eyes. She took it, her fingers brushing his, the contact lingering like a silent promise. "He'll be fine," Daniel said, his voice low but certain, as though the words alone could anchor them against the storm of uncertainty. Margaret's gaze lifted to meet his, her own voice wavering when she replied, "How do you know?" For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of his own losses pressing against the edges of the answer. But then he met her eyes, the firelight catching the gold in their depths, and said simply, "Because you're still here." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, of resilience, of presence, of the unspoken bond that had grown between them the weeks since the storm had driven them together. Margaret's hand found his again, her fingers curling around his wrist as if to steady herself against the truth of his words. Together, they watched Theo's restless form, the boy's breathing gradually slowing as the tea worked its quiet magic. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of budding leaves, while inside the cabin, the world narrowed to the rhythm of the fire, the rise and fall of Theo's chest, and the unspoken understanding that neither of them would face the night alone. By dawn, the fever had broken, Theo's sleep deepening into the kind of stillness that spoke of healing. Margaret, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, leaned into Daniel's shoulder, her head resting there for the first time without hesitation. Just for a moment, just long enough to let herself be held, to let the warmth of his presence seep into the hollows carved by years of fear and loss. And in that quiet, Daniel felt something shift within him, a thawing of his own, a realization that the ache of loneliness he'd carried for so long was beginning to soften, not into absence, but into something new, something rooted in the fragile, enduring promise of connection. Spring painted the land green, but shadows crept in like weeds through cracks in the soil, threading their way into the fragile peace Daniel and Margaret had built. The thaw had softened the earth, coaxing crocuses and violets to bloom along the cabin's edge. When the first warning came, a rider cresting the ridge at dawn, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. His name was Ethan, though Margaret flinched to hear it spoken aloud again. He dismounted with a casual arrogance, his boots crunching on the gravel path as though he'd never abandoned them to the wolves of winter. His smile was a blade, all edge and no warmth, and his eyes, cold, calculating, swept over the children huddled on the porch before settling on Margaret. "Those are my kids," he said, voice smooth as river stone. Margaret's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "You left us to die," she replied, the words clipped, a scar torn open. Daniel stepped forward then, his broad frame a silent wall between Ethan and the cabin. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who'd already buried too much. "They're not yours anymore." Ethan laughed, a hollow, brittle sound that made Rose flinch, and pulled folded papers from his coat. "Funny thing, the law," he said, tossing them onto the porch railing. "Turns out, abandonment doesn't erase a father's rights." The sheriff arrived by midday, a wiry man with a frown etched into his face like a birthmark. He glanced at the children, then at Daniel and Margaret, his gaze lingering on the carved animals lining the windowsill, the mended fence posts, the garden where Margaret now dug her hands into the soil daily. Ethan pressed his case, citing statutes and loopholes, but Daniel didn't raise his voice. Instead, he gestured to Elijah, who stood clutching a wooden rabbit he named Hopper, to Theo sketching birds in the dirt with a stick, to Rose clinging to her doll, Jasmine, her knuckles white. "They survived because of her," Daniel said, nodding to Margaret. "Because of this place." The sheriff hesitated, his hand drifting to the buckle of his holster, but the pause was enough. The town gathered like a storm rolling in. Clara in her patched shawl, Doc Hadley leaning on his cane, Pastor Elias with his Bible tucked under one arm. Their voices rose like a chorus, a cacophony of truth. She's their mother. He's their protector. Clara spat a curse at Ethan, calling him a vulture in a man's coat. Doc Hadley recounted tending to the children's frostbitten toes the night they arrived, hollow-eyed and half-dead. Pastor Elias simply held up a hymn book, its pages marked with the ink of Margaret's steady handwriting. Ethan's face darkened, his confidence cracking like thin ice. When the sheriff finally turned his horse toward town, muttering about needing more time to review the case, Ethan spat a curse into the dirt and rode off alone. But the threat lingered, coiled in the air like a snake beneath the porch steps. That night, Margaret stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the horizon. "He'll be back," she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He simply added another log to the fire, the flames licking higher, ready to light the way through whatever came next. The cabin hummed with the quiet aftermath of defiance, the children asleep on the rug, their dreams restless but unbroken, the scent of broth lingering in the air, the faint creak of the cradle Daniel had carved, rocking gently in the draft. Margaret's eyes traced the garden outside, where the first sprouts of lettuce and carrots pushed through the thawing soil, a testament to her hands' labor and hope. She thought of how she'd once feared planting roots, terrified of what might come to destroy them. Now roots had grown anyway, tangled and stubborn, anchoring them all to this place, this life. Daniel sat beside her at the table, his hands calloused and still, the knife he'd been sharpening resting idle. He didn't speak, but his presence was a quiet anchor, the way he'd become since the day she'd arrived, a man who'd learned to measure grace in small things, a shared bowl of stew, a carved fox on the mantel, the way he'd begun humming again while chopping wood. Margaret turned to him, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. "What if he takes them?" Daniel met her gaze, his own steady but shadowed by a grief he'd thought buried. "Then I'll ride to Helena myself. I'll bring every soul from this town to testify what he is. I'll make sure the world sees him for what he is, a man who walked away from his own blood." His words hung heavy, not with bravado, but with the certainty of someone who'd already lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine sap, the first whispers of spring mingling with the lingering chill of winter's ghost. Inside, the fire cast long shadows that danced like memories reborn. The carved animals on the shelves, the mended socks drying near the hearth, the children's boots lined neatly by the door, still caked in yesterday's mud. This place wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a home, stitched together from loss and survival, from the quiet acts of carving toys, sharing broth, and holding one another when the world outside threatened to pull them apart. When dawn broke, Margaret found Daniel in the garden, his hands buried in the soil alongside hers, planting rows of beans and peas in silence. The children emerged one by one, their laughter tentative but real, chasing rabbits through the slushy underbrush, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. For a moment, the weight of Ethan's threat lifted, replaced by the stubborn, unyielding rhythm of life. But even as the sun climbed higher, melting the last frost from the eaves, Margaret knew the storm wasn't gone. It lingered, waiting to break. And when it did, they would face it together, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as a family forged in the fire of choice, of love that refused to be undone. The law returned with the weight of winter itself, a judge's ruling delivered in a voice as cold and final as a frostbitten branch snapping in two. Custody granted to Ethan. Margaret's breath caught, her knees nearly buckling beneath the verdict's crushing certainty. The courtroom air felt thick, stale with the scent of ink and authority, as though the very walls had conspired to deny her. Rose, small and fierce, stepped between her and Ethan, clutching her doll, Jasmine, to her chest like a shield. "He's nothing," the girl whispered, her voice trembling but unyielding, her eyes locked on Ethan's smug smirk. Daniel's voice cut through the silence like a blade through ice. "Make it public. Let the town testify what he is." The judge hesitated, his gavel poised midair, the weight of community pressure palpable in the crowded room. He relented. 3 days to gather proof, a reprieve that felt both fragile and fateful. Daniel rode to Helena at dawn, his horse's hooves churning up clods of thawing earth as he rallied the town. Clara, her shawl patched but her voice sharp, agreed to speak of Margaret's tireless work at the store, of how she'd mended socks for pennies to keep the children fed. Doc Hadley, his hands steady despite his age, vowed to recount the night the family arrived, hollow-eyed and half-dead, saved only by Margaret's refusal to surrender. Pastor Elias, Bible clutched to his chest, promised to testify to the quiet grace with which Margaret had rebuilt not just a home, but a sanctuary. Even young Ben Miller, the stable hand with a heart too big for his wiry frame, offered to describe how the children laughed now, how they no longer flinched at raised voices. Daniel returned as dusk fell, his face lined with exhaustion, but his resolve unbroken. Margaret met him at the door, her hand steady as she packed a satchel of essentials: soap, a comb, a scrap of paper with Theo's doodles. "Fear hides in your bones," she murmured, her voice a thread of honesty woven through steel. Daniel's reply was quiet but unshakable. "But it's not all you're made of." The trial unfolded like a storm breaking over the town. Margaret stood in the courtroom, her back straight, her voice calm but cutting as she recounted Ethan's abandonment. The frozen wagon wheel, the hollow promises, the way he'd left them to die beneath a sky that offered no mercy. Daniel followed, his testimony a quiet thunder. He spoke of healing, of Elijah carving wooden rabbits beside him, of Rose naming her doll after a woman he'd loved and lost, of Theo sketching dreams on his scraps of paper. He described Margaret's hands, mending shirts, kneading dough, brushing hair from Rose's brow, not as acts of survival, but of belonging. The town's defiance swelled behind them. Clara spat curses at Ethan, calling him a vulture in a man's coat. Doc Hadley held up a pair of frostbitten socks, a grim relic of the children's arrival. Pastor Elias simply quoted scripture, his voice trembling with conviction. Where there is love, there is no fear. The judge's gavel fell like an axe splitting wood. Custody granted to Margaret. No appeal. The words hung in the air, disbelieving and radiant. Ethan's face contorted, his bitterness dissolving like frost beneath a sudden sun. He spat a curse into the dirt and rode off, his shadow shrinking into the horizon. That night, the cabin hummed with a different kind of silence, one not born of grief, but of triumph. Margaret stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the stars emerge. Daniel added another log to the fire, its flames licking higher, brighter, as if to light the way into a future no longer haunted by what-ifs. Outside, the last snow melted into the earth. Inside, the children slept soundly, their breaths synced, their dreams full of butterflies and wolves. And if you listen closely, even now, you might hear it, that soft, relentless beat of kindness growing roots, louder than any storm. Back at the cabin, the cradle Daniel had carved sat by the fire, rocking gently in the breeze that slipped through the cracked window. Its rhythmic creaking blended with the soft crackle of flames, a lullaby for the weary and the reborn. The room hummed with warmth, the air thick with the mingling scents of pine resin, dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of melted snow carried in on their boots. Margaret stood beside him, her fingers brushing the wooden ring he'd made months ago, a simple circle of ashwood, its edges smoothed by calloused hands that had once carved it in solitude, in the hollow silence of grief. Now, she held it out to him, her palm trembling slightly, as though offering a piece of her own heart. "I'd like to stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of every unspoken moment they'd shared. "Not just through the next storm, not just to raise these kids, but because when I look at you, I see home." Daniel pulled her close without hesitation, his arms wrapping around her like the cabin's walls, steady, sheltering, unyielding. Her cheek pressed against his chest, and he felt the steady drum of her heartbeat, a rhythm that no longer echoed loneliness, but something softer, fiercer. Outside, the last snow melted in quiet surrender, trickling into the earth as if apologizing for its stubborn delay. The land stretched awake, patches of green pushing through the thawing soil, crocuses blooming defiantly where ice had clung for too long. Inside, the children slept, their breaths synced in a way only the truly exhausted could manage. Elijah sprawled on his back, one arm flung wide, clutching the wooden horse he'd named Hopper. Rose curled beside him, her doll Jasmine tucked beneath her chin, her lips parted in a half-smile as if dreaming of butterflies. The fire popped and spat, casting shadows that danced like memories reborn. Abigail's laughter in the garden, Margaret's first hesitant smile across the breakfast table, the day Elijah carved his first clumsy rabbit and declared it better than real. Daniel's gaze lingered on the mantel, where his fox carving now stood beside Margaret's mended socks and Rose's drawings of wolves with wings. Symbols of a life stitched together from fragments, from loss, from the stubborn refusal to let winter have the final word. Margaret stepped back just enough to meet his eyes, her hand still gripping the wooden ring. "It's not just about them," she murmured, her voice fraying at the edges. "It's about us. About how you don't ask me to be anything but what I am. How you stayed, even when you didn't have to." Daniel's thumb brushed her wrist, rough and warm. "You stayed too," he said, "even when you thought you couldn't." Outside, the wind carried the scent of earth and ash and promise. Inside, the cradle rocked on, its motion slow and certain, as if already welcoming the future it would one day hold. And if you listen closely, even now, you might hear it, that soft, relentless beat of kindness growing roots, louder than any storm. Not thunder, not chaos, but the quiet, unyielding pulse of two hearts learning to trust, of hands joined not out of necessity but choice, of a home built not in grandeur, but in the small, sacred acts of carving toys, sharing broth, and holding one another when the world outside threatened to pull them apart. The night deepened, the fire dimming to embers that glowed like hidden stars. Margaret leaned into Daniel's shoulder, her eyes tracing the shadows on the walls. The children's silhouettes, the carved animals, the cradles swaying in time with the wind. "They're safe here," she whispered. "We all are." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth of it was in the air, in the way the cabin held them, in the way the storm had come and gone and found them still standing. Together, alive, and somewhere beyond the snow and the past, a new rhythm had taken root. A quiet, unshakable song of belonging, louder than fear, louder than loss, louder than the storms that would inevitably come again. But not tonight. Tonight, there was only this. The warmth of shared breath, the weight of hands clasped tight, and the cradle's gentle sway, rocking the promise of tomorrow.